Think about outdoor sports. Baseball, tennis, golf, birding, football. Hold it. What was that fourth one? That's right, birding. Birding is one of the fastest growing sports in the 21st century. Right up there with NASCAR, but with a lot less noise. There's a movie about it. There's even a World Series. Birding grew out of bird watching, and some people still call it that. But you can watch birds in your backyard from an easy chair. Modern birding requires more. Birding is all about friendly competition. You compete with yourself, trying to best your previous record for a day, a month, a year, at various venues near home or far away. You compete with your friends, as everyone tests his skill, trying to find for the group something hidden, something rare, something drop-dead gorgeous. And you try to grow the list of species you've seen. This is a lifelong game and a source of pride for many. Of course, you don't have to be a competitor to be a birder. Lots of birders simply enjoy walking with friends, being outdoors, and sharing the knowledge that the sport requires. For them, it's all about the birds, the awe they inspire, and the wonderful places you get to visit looking for them. For those who are in it for the chase, it's all about numbers. You want a high score, a lot of different species, and if they are tough ones to find, all the better. 100 in a day is very good. Chasing the day's birds, birders often travel hundreds of miles. They go from before dawn, when you can only hear the birds, until it's dark. The sport's required skill has nothing to do with making a ball go where you want it to, like so many other sports. The skill is to be able to identify an object, often far away, often small, and usually moving, by a few characteristic looks or sounds, and get it right. In the US and Canada, there are over 800 species of birds. Some are common, some are rare. Some have only shown up once or twice. The best birders know them all. A very few have seen almost every one. It took them a lifetime, some luck, and a whole lot of travel. From New Year's Day 1998 to New Year's Day 1999, Sandy Comito was able to find 745 North American species. You want more? Go overseas. The world list of possibilities is over 10,000. Birding has a long history. Back in the 1950s, before there were nerds, before there were geeks, there were bird watchers, a staple on black and white TV. Middle-aged folks with outlandish outfits, big round glasses, and silly hats. They were always good for a laugh.
We are in search of the elusive yellow-bellied sapsucker.
Eventually, the baby boomers decided that being out of doors was a good thing, and looking for hidden treasures like birds while you were at it wasn't so funny after all. Thus the rise of modern birding. They did keep the silly hats. If you've ever wondered how all this started, you might go back to when people wore hats like this one. Back to Scotland. There, in 1794, a wandering peddler and part-time weaver was arrested for writing poetry. It was simple poetry, written in a thick dialect not everyone could understand, like rap music for the 18th century. It agitated against a greedy factory owner, but the boss understood it and had the poet thrown in jail. The poet's name was Alexander Wilson. Wilson was at home roaming the Scottish woods and hills. Jail was a horror, and when he was finally released, he had enough sense to hop onto the Swift, a brigantine bound for the New World. Wilson made a new home in Philadelphia. It turned out to be a good choice. He hated the textile industry, so he took jobs teaching school. He wasn't happy at that either, but in Philly, he made influential friends. William Bartram, the botanist and explorer. Charles Wilson Peale, impresario and artist, who owned his own museum. Other people with money. Wilson took to the American woods just like those back home. He fell in love with the birds. He decided to study them. He learned to draw and paint them. His first efforts were cute but amateurish. But he kept it up, and after a while he had become a competent painter of birds. His Philadelphia friends provided money, and a career was born. In 1803, Wilson began a book he called The American Ornithology. 10 years later, he had 7 volumes and had illustrated over 300 species. Whenever possible, Wilson would capture his birds to paint them from life. His skill lay in rendering details that were ignored by previous artists. 80 years before, Mark Catesby, an Englishman living in Carolina, had illustrated a number of American birds. Here is Catesby's rendition of a common bird, the brown thrasher. Wilson also did a brown thrasher. There's quite a difference. Now, here's the actual bird. You can see who was accurate. Just look at the beak and the eye. This is Catesby's wood thrush. Here is Wilson's. And an authentic one with its fat, round spots. Although not perfect, Wilson's images resembled the real birds. Wilson embarked on several journeys through the eastern United States looking for birds. On horseback when he could, by boat when he had to, but often on foot for weeks at a time. He traveled watching birds and describing their habits. He shot them and painted them. He sat for many hours watching birds, and it's for this, more than for his art, that he is remembered. To read his American Ornithology is to find many of the things that today's birders know about birds. But in Wilson, you see them written down for the first time. For example, Wilson talked about the flight of the black vulture. Their mode of flight also varies from that of the turkey buzzard. The black vulture flaps its wings 5 or 6 times rapidly, then sails with them extended nearly horizontally. The turkey buzzard seldom flaps its wings, and when sailing, they form an angle with the body upwards. He made the point that people of the South, where black vultures were very common, knew that these birds were nature's garbage men and so didn't hunt them. leaving them alone to clear the countryside of putrefying carrion. On chilly mornings, people allowed the birds to congregate atop their chimneys. This despite the fact that, after having gorged themselves, the birds vomit down the chimneys, which must be intolerably disgusting and must provoke the ill will of those whose hospitality is required. Wilson was much taken by ruby-throated hummingbirds, so much so that he wrote a poem to one. At the end, he says, "Like scales of burnished gold, they dazzling show. Now sink to shade, now like a furnace glow." He's talking about the gold gorget of the male ruby-throat, often seen but never shown in field guides and rarely mentioned by anyone. Wilson described how hummingbirds slow their pulse and breathing in cold weather, and he proved that they are active flycatchers. No one before him had taken the time to look. His dissection showed a heart as large as the bird's skull and a tongue that passed around the back of the head like a woodpecker's. Wilson accurately described the nesting and feeding behavior of the black skimmer. He showed how it only took swimming prey and only while flying. Before him, the European experts believed that the birds stood in the water and ate clams. Wilson's writings are full of such revelations. At the time, they were new to science. His descriptions are as fresh today as they were 200 years ago. That's why he's the father of American ornithology. For some weeks, as he traveled the Mississippi Valley, his most faithful companion was a Carolina parakeet, wing-shot by him and then adopted. He named her Poll. Poll rode in Wilson's pocket, coming out to eat, happily squawking away as he combed the forest in search of new birds. While other travelers on the Natchez Trace were set upon by bands of Chickasaw warriors, Poll's antics immediately diffused any hostile intent and provided Wilson safe passage over that dangerous trail. But Poll decided to fly away, and at just the wrong time. It was at dawn, on the boat home from New Orleans. Her wounded wing wouldn't provide enough lift, and she drowned at sea while her master was still asleep. You can see Poll in Wilson's famous painting of her. She, and everyone like her, is now extinct. Wilson kept another, now extinct bird for a couple of days. He shot and winged an ivory-billed woodpecker. Capturing the bird, he thrust it under his coat and proceeded to spend the night at an inn in Wilmington, North Carolina. He locked the bird in his room and went out to see to his horse. He came back an hour later. The ivory bill was on the wall. The bed was covered in plaster. The bird had already broken through to the external siding, and in another hour he would have been out. Wilson tied him to a mahogany table and went out again for some woodpecker food. What he intended to feed an ivory-billed woodpecker wasn't specified. The bird took his vengeance on the table, and Wilson returned to find an angry bird and a table in splinters. Over the next 3 days, he drew and painted this ivory bill, stopping frequently to dress the cuts it inflicted. Most of Wilson's time in this productive decade was spent in preparing and selling his American ornithology. Getting it printed and engraved, finding customers, and getting paid was a constant fight. He ended up not only writing it, but personally had to color many of the engravings one by one in each volume. The strain weakened him. One summer's day in 1813, fording a stream to retrieve a bird, he contracted dysentery. 3 days later, he was dead. One of Wilson's journal entries alludes to an unannounced visit in March 1810 to a general store in Shippingport, Kentucky. What happened there was recorded by one of the shopkeepers. Wilson opened a volume of his book to show his bird paintings, hoping for a sale. The younger shopkeeper liked the drawings. He saw some birds that he didn't know. He was about to sign on for the book when his older partner said to him in French, "Why are you buying this book? Your bird paintings are far better, and your notes on the birds are more complete." Wilson understood French, or at least the tone of the older man's voice. He asked the younger man if he could see these paintings. The young Frenchman brought them out. Whereas Wilson had several species rather stiffly posed on a page, here was a full sheet of paper dedicated to each bird. Many were life-sized. They were engaging, active, vibrant images, products of a professional artist. Here are renditions of a screech owl done by each of the men at about this time. Indeed, they may have been examined at this very meeting. Wilson was speechless. Out here on the frontier, a rival. And that was the end of the transaction. Wilson stayed in town a couple of days, but made no sales anywhere along this stretch of the Ohio River. The visit seems to have lit a fire under the shopkeeper, whose name was Audubon. He began to pursue his own dream of painting all the birds of the United States and its territories. It took him another 20 years, but he did it. John James Audubon grew up during the French Revolution. His talent as an artist was evident when he was a boy. The young Audubon developed a special affinity for birds, and even his early work is good. When Napoleon's draft threatened to take him in 1803, his father spirited him away to the United States to manage the family's lead mine in Pennsylvania. The young man was a disaster at business. The mine failed. He was very good with birds, however. He drew them. He studied them. He continued drawing, trying crayons, pastels, watercolor. He used a frame of wires arranged over a grid. On this, he placed his specimens in lifelike poses. The grid assured that measurements were correct even in large birds like turkeys or cranes. Heads were turned toward you or away, not just in flat side view like other people's drawings. Wings and feet were positioned realistically. Multiple individuals in each painting assured that even usually hidden features were shown. Birds were perched on plants native to the bird's habitat, often drawn by assistants who were experts in their own right. In some cases, towns were included in the backgrounds, such as this 1831 view of Charleston, South Carolina, behind a pair of long-billed curlews. Audubon traveled the same paths as Wilson, but also visited Florida, Labrador, and the Great Plains, giving him a comprehensive collection of birds. Wilson had 10 years to work, but Audubon had over 30. More than Wilson, Audubon told stories. His stories are full of hunting tales and the spectacle of early America. Billions of passenger pigeons, huge flocks of shorebirds, hordes of bobolinks covering acres of fields. What is it about his work that captivates us more than any other? The first thing you notice about Audubon's birds is that these are creatures that move. They are always doing something, reaching for an insect or fighting a snake. Here is one of his best-known paintings. It's more than just a melodramatic tableau. Each mockingbird is there for a reason. This one shows the white outer tail feathers and the wing patch. This one lets you know they are visible underneath as well. And here, with wings and tail more closed, is like you'd see one perched. This guy is just for the drama. And then there were the mystery birds. Several species Audubon painted are gone. Cuvier's kinglet, the small-headed flycatcher, described by both Audubon and Wilson. The wonderfully named carbonated swamp warbler, a bird reported once again in Minnesota in 2008. Unfortunately, there was no photo. And finally, the bird of Washington, a giant eagle with a 10-foot 2-inch wingspan. Audubon measured it. Others had seen this bird too, but not today. Today, experts say that it was a young bald eagle, despite its huge size. Did Audubon make these birds up? Were they the last of their kind? No one knows. But birds like these are part of the Audubon mystique. In his career, Wilson painted over 300 species of birds. Audubon did over 400. Pretty good for a couple of guys who didn't even own a pair of binoculars. These men were the first ones who really paid attention to America's birds. In the next episode, we will look at the golden age of bird study and bird hunting, and how those occupations led to the birding we know today. The Civil War was over. Interest in birds was growing, but anyone who was after birds wanted them dead. Scientists were no exception. They wanted specimens. Specimens to prove newly discovered species. Specimens to establish subspecies. How a song sparrow from Carolina was different from a western one. Specimens to fill cabinets and attract eager students. Specimens to sell to wealthy collectors. There were never enough specimens. And if you had to put a face on collecting them, it would have been this one. It's Elliot Coues, spelled C-O-U-E-S, but pronounced by his family, Coues. In 1863, Coues became a surgeon in the U.S. Army. Stationed in various posts in the West for 17 years, he spent every spare moment collecting birds wherever he saw them. Soldiers on expedition always knew where he was, listening to his shotgun blast away in the distance. He would return with his pockets filled with birds before skinning them and making notes on where and when they were obtained. Science had come to Indian country. By the time they were done, Coues and his scientific colleagues had described almost every variation of every bird species in America, using mountains of specimens. Think back to these men who originally sorted it out next time you're staring through a scope trying to decide what kind of dowitcher you were looking at. Back then, you didn't have binoculars. You had your gun, and you chose it carefully. In his Key to North American Birds, Coues provided all the details about what gun to use, what shot, how to finish off a bird that isn't dead yet, and how to skin it fast and clean. It's a glimpse into a world as long ago as an old-time Western. Use mustard seed or dust shot, a small bird that would have been torn to pieces by a few large pellets may be riddled with mustard seed and yet be preservable. Coues didn't explain how to shoot. It's like playing a violin, he said. You do it well by experience. But sometimes even the best-made shot fails to kill its target. At such times you have to finish the job yourself. Here, Dr. Coues tells you exactly what to do. This is to be accomplished with all small birds by suffocation. Squeeze the bird tightly across the chest. The bird will make vigorous but ineffectual efforts to breathe. In a moment, the system relaxes with a painful shiver, the light fades from the eyes, and the lids close. I assure you it'll make you wince the first few times. You had better hold the poor creature behind you. Armed with Coues' tips and a 14-gauge shotgun, students of bird study were free to roam the countryside and blast away. Red-headed woodpecker. That was easy. Cerulean warbler. I needed one of those. Let's get the female, too. Bachman's warbler. Wow, that bird will make my collection. And Pittenweck's flycatcher. Now, what kind is it? Just look in Dr. Coues' handbook. Olive green, 6 1/4 inches long, wing is 3 inches long, beak is just under 1/2 inch. Must be an Acadian flycatcher, and Pittenweck's fluorescens. Someone once asked Dr. Coues, how many birds of one kind do I need for my collection? As many as you can get, was the answer. What you don't require, you can trade to someone who does. The ornithologists killed a lot of birds, but far and away, the more serious problem of the era was market gunning, hunting for food. Untrammeled immigration from Europe brought to the big cities a demand for cheap protein food, and game was it. Birds were sold to East Coast and Midwest vendors, then to housewives for a few pennies. Wealthy people wanted gulls, terns, and egret feathers to wear on their hats, too. Hunters kept the railroads busy shipping food and feathers. These hunters tailored their techniques to each species' behavior. Passenger pigeons roosted in vast colonies covering acres. They were knocked down with sticks, gathered in nets, or blasted as they came in. As the sun set, waterfowl gathered in favorite locations to spend the night in huge floating flocks. They were shot with cannons mounted on the fronts of boats, then collected like Easter eggs. The trusting shorebirds refused to fly away when the first volley killed or maimed a few. Hunters would shoot and shoot at the wheeling flocks until the few survivors became too sparse to hit. The number of birds killed, as described in the literature of the day, is staggering. Wagon loads of prairie chickens, shorebirds by the ton, passenger pigeons carpeting the ground and fed to pigs. Men became famous for the number of birds they could produce. One such man was Henry Clay Merritt of Kewanee, Illinois. Merritt hunted prairie chickens, ducks, snipe, and woodcock all year round, and pioneered the use of ice houses to store his booty in warm weather. At any one time, his warehouses could hold 1,000 snipe, 300 barrels of canvasback and redhead ducks, 150 barrels of woodcock. During the 1870s, he bought a train car packed with passenger pigeons and sold them to restaurants and markets in Chicago, Cincinnati, and the East. Half of these birds arrived too spoiled to eat and were thrown out. Chicago actually passed an ordinance against throwing rotten prairie chickens into the street. In 1873, 600,000 prairie chickens were shipped to Chicago at a price of about $2.50 each in today's money. It was about a quarter back then. This went on all year, every year. On the East Coast, in the winter, the market gunners abandoned upland game and went to the shore, to the Chesapeake Bay and Carolina's Pamlico Sound. Here, the specialties were shorebirds, usually called snipe, no matter what species they were, geese, swans, and especially ducks. Of all the ducks, the delicately flavored canvasback was king. While a black duck brought in $1.25 and a pintail just $1, you could get $7 for a prime canvasback. In today's money, that's over $50. Ruddy ducks, which covered the bay in rafts half a mile long and half a mile wide, were considered inedible by the locals. When they discovered that New Yorkers loved them, the price went up and the birds went down. By 1900, most people began to see decreases in the number of birds that visited each year. Sport hunters and conservationists finally spoke up. By 1913, most states and provinces had passed bag limits and established hunting seasons. But the numbers of birds enjoyed way back when were no more. Elliot Coues died on Christmas Day, 1899. He didn't see the revolution happen from shooting birds to watching them. For most of his life, he derided the opera glass fiends, his term for bird watchers. He maintained that birds were there to kill, for science, for food, or for sport. But near the end, he softened just a bit. He wrote, along with naturalist Mabel Wright, a bird book for children and called it Citizen Bird. He asked a college student to illustrate it. The kid's name was Louis Fuertes, and he takes our story into the 20th century because from 1900 to 1930, it was hard to find a book about American birds that didn't have ink drawings or paintings by Fuertes. Like Audubon, Fuertes began drawing birds as a child. At age 15, his birds already had a lively look to them. When he met Coues, he was only 20. He was still learning, and it was pretty clear that he was learning from Audubon. Many of his subjects from this period were done exactly in the style that the old master had used 80 years before. His copies were sometimes better than Audubon's originals. But with his first commissions, he quickly went beyond copying to a style all his own. He did these eastern kingbirds in 1895. By 1901, his kingbird portrait had the posture and attitude you can see in the live bird. But to truly see what Fuertes could do, you have to look at his birds of prey. These American kestrels were painted about 1895. They still look like the work of Audubon. So does this broad-winged hawk. But by 1899, Fuertes was doing this. And he never looked back. No Americans, and very few artists anywhere else, had ever gotten birds so right. One critic of Audubon said that his birds looked like they had no feathers. Fuertes's birds have feathers, soft feathers, ruffled feathers, strong flight feathers. It was said of Fuertes that he captured a bird's gestalt, its being. His paintings are like having the real bird right in front of your face. Fuertes's raptors look mean. They kill things. Their prey looks very dead. He also got the important color patterns or field marks correct. Look at this simple plate of thrushes, a group of birds difficult for the beginner to separate. This figure, taken from Chapman's Birds of Eastern North America, is not among Fuertes' finest, but what you need to see is there. The wood thrush's redder head and big round spots. The veery's overall light brown and faint spotting. Swainson's thrush with a prominent ring around its eye. The gray-cheeked thrush's lack of one, and the hermit thrush's reddish tail. Everything you need to know to identify a thrush in a tree, or the one you just shot in your hand. Until modern field guides came along and distilled these features into an easy-to-remember format, this was the best you could find. Well, almost. An egg collector and passable artist named Chester Albert Reed produced a field guide in 1906. Reed gave birders useful pictures and simple descriptions, plus a lot more information and even a song description. Before World War II, no matter what you carried into the field, there was likely to be a little Reed guide in your pocket. But he wasn't much of an artist, and he died young, so today he is mostly unremembered. Fuertes was an artist, the best. He also died too soon. On the morning of August 22, 1927, Fuertes and his wife Margaret were driving home, enjoying the New York countryside. He had a new set of paintings done in Ethiopia and had taken them downstate to show his friend Frank Chapman. Near the town of Unadilla, Lewis and Margaret approached a railroad crossing. 2 cars and a hay wagon were waiting for the Baltimore and Hudson Express to pass by. Fuertes decided he could beat the train. He sped his roadster around the vehicles and across the track. He wasn't fast enough. The train hit the rear fender and flipped the car, which caught fire. As help arrived, Fuertes lay dying with a fractured skull. Margaret sustained multiple burns. The sheaf of paintings in the back seat was thrown clear and survived, as did the artist's legacy. Through his very accessible art, he showed the public their birds and taught Americans to appreciate them. And appreciate them they did. It was in the first 2 decades of the 20th century that the Audubon movement became a powerful force to save birds. Nature study was something children enjoyed, and insect-eating birds were described to them as useful. A president with a big mustache and a bigger smile pushed for conservation. It was in this atmosphere that a little boy jumped off his piano bench, grabbed his mother's opera glasses, and stepped outside into a Long Island spring. He was looking for birds. He spent the rest of his life looking for birds. This little guy grew up to make printed checklists a part of every birdwalk, and to make the car caravan the way birders got around. He learned exactly where to go and when to find special birds, and insisted that everyone else be able to do it too, near their own homes. But most of all, he taught how to identify birds by their shapes, habits, and color patterns, their field marks, and to do it without a gun. His name was Ludlow Griscom, and between 1920 and 1959, he was, as his friends called him, the Dean of American birdwatchers. It all began with war. In the 1800s, Army commanders put away their telescopes and began using lightweight field glasses to keep track of troop movements. The small, weak field glasses morphed into binoculars with magnifying powers of 6 times, 7, 10, even more. Soldiers brought them home, and it wasn't long before everyone wanted a pair. 6-year-old Ludlow Griscom got his hands on a pair of opera glasses in 1896. While he was growing up in Manhattan, he found birds in Central Park. In those days, you could shoot all the birds you cared to in parts of the city. But watching them with binoculars often got young Ludlow chased out of the park. So he snuck around with whatever bird pictures he could find and a book called the Bird Calendar. It told him what to expect in Central Park each month. Back in those days of ragtime and the first motor cars, lots of children studied nature. But it was a rare boy who had Ludlow Griscom's driving interest in birds. He went to the New York museums and compared his notes to the bird specimens. He realized that certain features of each type of bird could identify it. A stripe, a color, a pattern. He called them field marks. Each bird was distinct. He had a gigantic memory and unusually sharp eyes. While others identified birds by shooting them and examining the corpses, by the time he reached college, Griscom did it without a gun. He knew so much about birds and was so enthusiastic that he was invited to join the scientists of New York's prestigious Linnaean Society. Here, the student got a little cocky. He announced at one of the meetings that he had found a rare bird, a Bicknell's thrush in New York City. He may have been right, but his identification was based simply on its appearance and its song. He had no specimen, nothing concrete to back him up. The Linnaeans came from a long tradition of bird shooting. They just didn't believe it. No competent person would identify a difficult bird like Bicknell's thrush with just binoculars and not a gun. He couldn't defend himself. For 2 years, they punished him by ignoring anything he reported. That meeting and the 2 years that followed it hurt him like nothing he had ever known. He resumed his studies even harder than before. After a while, armed with a new pair of field glasses, he began to challenge society members in the field. The story is told about a walk in the woods with a Linnaean professor. Young Griscom had his binoculars. The old man had a shotgun. They walked along. They saw a small bird high in a tree. "Cape May warbler, female," said Ludlow. Down fell a female Cape May warbler. Over and over again, Ludlow identified a bird on sight, and the unbelieving elder brought it to the ground.
"Up there, a black-throated blue."
The kid's ID was always correct.
"There's an oven bird."
Ludlow Griscom had proven that you could accurately identify a bird at a distance without killing it first. He could identify a magnolia warbler in a split second by the distinctive black and white pattern of its tail. He could recognize ducks flying offshore by their shapes. Long hours in the field and in the museum made him better at this than anyone else. By 1920, the word had spread all over the Northeast. Ludlow Griscom was an icon, and the study of birds would never be the same. On May 6th, 1937, the German airship Hindenburg went down in flames over Lakehurst, New Jersey. Only hours before, it astonished residents of Boston as it passed over the city. Ludlow Griscom was there, on the faculty at Harvard, and the best-known birder in America. He may have seen the Hindenburg, but on that day he was preparing for aviators of a different kind. As word spread about his ability to identify birds, Griscom became the emperor of birding. Massachusetts was his capital, but his empire was the whole eastern United States. "You be near Asheville, North Carolina, the third week in April," he told one nature writer, "and you will see the warblers pour across the mountains." He was right. There were swarms of warblers, the writer said, warblers beyond count. Now, in May, the birds had made it to New England. May in Massachusetts is spring migration, and for birders, Griscom's bird walks were the place to be. People dreamed of being invited to one of his walks. Although not open to the public as bird walks are today, there were always plenty of students and other non-professionals invited to join in a small caravan of cars that would traverse eastern Massachusetts on a schedule as strict as a New York subway. You started before dawn, and in May, that meant 4 a.m., with breakfast on board. Breakfast on board was Griscom's way of saying, "You better have eaten because we are not stopping to feed you." They would bird all morning, stopping at spots where he would produce birds where others saw nothing. He would identify a sparrow as it flew from a bush before anyone else could even see it. He identified specks far out at sea as rare birds. He was usually right. You got more birds on a Griscom bird walk than with anyone else. But success came with a price. If he asked you to flush a bird out of some poison ivy, you did it. If he walked ankle deep onto the mud flat, you had to go too. If he drove his car through the mud, you followed him up to your axles. It was his rules. He was the only man I ever knew who could strut sitting down, said one colleague. But despite his pomposity, he loved to teach the newcomers. He was having fun on these walks and wanted to share it. For all his use of visible at a distance field marks and his teaching of them to his students, Griscom didn't publish very many of them. You have to search his writings to find examples such as the yellow above the eye on a savanna sparrow, the white edging on the tail of a vesper sparrow, or the crescent-shaped spot on the face of Barrow's goldeneye. His descriptions are long and complicated. They appeared in academic journals. Amateurs rarely saw them. Perhaps that's why he's not better known today. Griscom died in 1959 after a series of strokes. He never did get to see how his field identification and his organized bird walks set what was an esoteric hobby for rich folks on the road to the popular sport it has become. He left explaining the field marks to someone else. One of his boys from the Bronx took his advice and wrote a guide encompassing Griscom-style field marks for just about every bird east of the Rockies. His name was Roger Tory Peterson, and he was the one who simplified bird identification. For Peterson, a dowitcher was the only shorebird where the white extended all the way up the back. A red-headed woodpecker was the only eastern bird with a completely red head. Red-bellied woodpeckers had a red cap and a back striped like a zebra. Lincoln's sparrow had a buffy band across the breast, while the similar-looking song sparrow didn't. A Kentucky warbler wore yellow glasses and had black sideburns. It was that easy. Peterson lived to see 3 generations of birders learn his methods. Peterson was a master at illustration, but he desperately wanted to be known as an artist. Painterly was what he called it. On a winter's evening in 1977, before a packed auditorium at the Smithsonian Institution, he proudly unveiled his latest painting. A pair of snowy owls on a 5-foot canvas as large as life, with a background of Arctic peaks, each bird staring right at the audience, which erupted into applause as Peterson introduced his creation. Peterson's owls were perfect in every detail. But look at this bird, a snowy owl with its ptarmigan prey. It's telling us, I'm a snowy owl. I'm eating. What are you going to do about it? That was the artist Peterson tried to emulate. That was Louis Agassiz's Fuertes. You can see a little bit of Fuertes today in every field guide that tries to portray accurate colors, postures, feather details, and looks of birds. 21st century birders require a lot from a field guide. No longer are a few accurate pictures of the most usually encountered birds enough. We expect range maps, pictures of subspecies, pictures of young birds, descriptions of behavior and songs. How does it look in flight? Where is it common? Where is it uncommon? And depictions of the finest details in plumage. All because everyone wants to find something rare. Audubon, Wilson, Coues, Fuertes, Griscom. Most birders today know little about them, but they are the giants on whose shoulders we all sit every time we go out with binoculars and a field guide. It is passed from the pursuit of new specimens by a few artists and scientists to a friendly, sports-like competition engaged in by millions. We lament that the numbers of birds that we see today is but a shadow of what was before. That's true. The time of flocks that darkened the sky or took days to fly by is gone. But wait. This bird is a marbled godwit, a favorite of the market hunters. Audubon saw them in flocks of thousands. By the 1920s, people in the Northeast felt lucky to see one bird a decade. Now they are not hunted and return each fall. They are increasing on their breeding grounds. They have returned from the brink. The time of having your breath stolen by the spectacle that is birds is still with us.